Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dolores Tarver. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and it is time for the TT Time with Dr. Tarver is a wellness-based podcast. It is not intended to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health provider. Yes, it is week 3 of September, and when I tell you it has been a lot going on, a whirlwind, if you will. We lost James Earl Jones, Frankie Beverly, Tito Jackson. We found out Diddy was arrested. It's just been a lot going on. The debate, we are still talking about our presidential debate. People are divided. If you're probably on your social media account considering blocking folks right now in this moment, we are just all over the place emotionally. And I think it is a great week to really talk about how we sometimes deal with our stress because what will people say? Like, oh, I need a drink, I need a smoke. Let me just, take a little something and ease the pain, numb what's going on, or just be able to put myself in a different space. We just want to kind of quiet all of the noise sometimes. It's just, living is stressful. And so we're just trying to navigate this to the best of our ability. And so this month we have been dedicated suicide awareness and prevention. We talked about last week. We just talked about being able to live in the space of taking good care of ourselves, self awareness in the first month. And we are going to transition in honor of National Alcohol and Drug Addiction Recovery Month to making different choices, right? Living in this place of recovery. So when we say we need to take the edge off this month, we're going to be talking about how to do it in ways that honor us and allow us to stay in recovery. And I know a lot of times when I talk about substance abuse, addictions, a lot of people are like, oh, that doesn't apply to me. And I frequently will point out to people that all of us have had or will have an addiction to something. It might be your work, it could be a person, it might be exercise, it might be food, it might be shopping, and yes, it could be cigarettes or vaping or marijuana or alcohol, or it could be cocaine, it could be methamphetamines, it could be over the counter cold medication, it could be pain medications. Like there are so many different things that we can become addicted to. So before you scroll past this episode, I will encourage you to stay with me as we talk about maintaining recovery. Now, if you have tried to make changes in your life, once you make a decision and you find your why and you're able to get on board with putting things in place to make the changes, you feel like, hey, like I'm good, right? I should be able to coast. But the reality is that maintaining is the hard part. We hit that initial step, which is difficult of getting going, but then we get some momentum and we're like, okay, but being able to stay in it, especially as stressors keep coming up, especially as time goes on, especially as there are triggers, as there are things that might be invitations that remind us of patterns, people in our lives who may be in that space that we're trying to be recovered from. And so it makes it very difficult think for us sometimes to stay in that maintenance, to stay in the recovery, if you will. And so it's important for us to be able to understand what are our triggers. And I know that that is a word, especially if you're on TikTok, that has been overused a lot. But triggers are just essentially the things that put us in the place to be reminded of something we experienced previously. And what it tends to do in the case of addiction is it places us back in a place of where we had a craving. Right? You know how you have a craving, you're like, oh, I got a taste for something sweet, which can also be an addiction. Or I just, I want to take some of this stress off. It's been a long day, it's been a long week, it's been a long month, and so I just want to do something that's going to give me a little bit of a high, if you will. I did a presentation this morning. We were talking about discrimination and harassment, and I always use the example of speeding as the thing that a lot of times you get in this habit of driving faster. Like I joke that the speed limit, we treat it like it's a suggestion and not that it's the law. And so, what keeps us speeding? Like, we get a little rush from going faster. We feel like if I go these extra 10 miles over the speed limit, 20 miles over the speed limit, it's going to get me there. We think it's going to cut half the time off. It doesn't, but that's what we think. Um, it may feel like it's an emergency, and so I'm anxious and I want to try to get there. But also because we don't get caught. So we speed because we get away with it. And it's not until we get pulled over, and we get that super speeder ticket, that we begin to really think about making some adjustments. The same thing is true with addictions that we have in our lives. Like, as long as they're not causing us any problems or we're ignoring said problems, we'll stay in that space. We can keep it hidden. People don't know. I can justify it, be able to rationalize to myself why I'm doing it. I don't do it that much. I only do it during this time, and don't recognize that I haven't actually developed any additional coping skills. And so then when I take that thing away, and I'm working on putting another thing in its place, that doesn't mean that I won't still have a tendency to go back to those old patterns, the thoughts that led to those behaviors, the feelings associated with those old behaviors. Those are our risk factors. And so we have to be very mindful that stress, right? So all of the things going on, that could be grief, that could be things in our environment that make us uncomfortable. We might be in a situation where you're in clutter, and clutter can really cause distress in your mind. And okay, I can't deal with this right now. And so I look for those escapes to be able to take me away or to be able to deal with it and ignore it. And so I'm using something to get me through it. Relationships tend to be a big stressor, and that is oftentimes when we'll find ourselves falling back into old patterns. You miss a person when you've been in a relationship with someone. It can be on again, off again. It could be somebody that you really loved. It was an intense relationship. It could be that this person represented for you some of the hopes and dreams that you thought would accomplish, or it could have been your long term partner who is no longer with you. You miss that. And when that relationship, for whatever reason, doesn't work out or it ends, whether that's things outside of your control or conflicts, then it hurts and there's a pain there. And that pain is what triggers us to try to numb and use something to be able to get away from that. And so, as we're trying to walk in recovery, we're navigating financial stress, job insecurity, might be job related challenges. These are the things that I think are probably the most stressful. Kids, being able to navigate, like just getting your basic needs met, or even manage all your commitments and trying to be at home. Like sometimes being at home by ourselves can be very painful, can be hard, can be challenging. You might have lost a child. There may be again that partner's not there anymore, and so you're at home, and silence can be so loud, and so you just want something to be able to help you get through that. You're taking things, drinking things, smoking things to try to get through the night, just to try to make it to the morning. And recovery for us is when that happens, because it's going to happen, right? Because that is part of this journey of recovery, when we're replacing old patterns and behaviors with these new things. That doesn't mean we're not going to crave those old things. And so being able to say, yeah, I would usually insert whatever addictive behavior here. However, because I'm in this place of maintaining this sobriety, that I'm going to make a different choice. And that can be tough, to make that different choice and to consistently make that different choice. I think we get through that first night and we're like, okay, it should be fine after that. And then you're like, oh no, it's still going on. And so, having to challenge those addictive thinking patterns and some of those compulsive self-defeating behaviors. Like I think a lot of times we sabotage ourselves because we haven't given ourselves an opportunity enough to practice other things. And so we cave, we fold, right? Like, oh, I did try, but it didn't work. And being able to stay in that recovery is about like understanding this thing that I did that was addictive, like it's going to have a whole separate feeling for me. It's going to feel different in my body when I have it. It is going to elicit different emotions. And so, not expecting that the things that I'm replacing it with are going to give me that same kind of feeling. Like, getting high is a different feeling. Having someone with you and you being by yourself, like that's a different feeling. Even though you learn to be by yourself, like it still doesn't feel the same as being with someone, particularly someone you love, even if sometimes they're unhealthy for us. But we miss the feeling of having that companionship and that connection. And sometimes we'll chase that even at a cost of ourselves. And so being able to be in recovery from that person who was abusive, being able to be in recovery from that person who can't actually give you what you need and deserve, having to be in recovery from being a person who is involved with people who are emotionally unavailable. Like that means I have to take responsibility for the choices that put me back in this situation, and that I'm really setting myself up to fail because I don't actually expect that there is hope, that there is a different outcome on the horizon. And that different outcome may not mean that I end up with the partner of my dreams, but it does end up meaning that I'm taking good care of myself and I'm making the best choices for myself. And I do think too, like it's important for us to recognize that prevention is always better than intervention. That recovery process is also about not putting myself back in situations that's going to make it very difficult for me not to make a healthy or putting myself in situations that are going to make it difficult for me to make a healthy choice, right? Like if I'm around other people and they're doing this thing that I'm trying to recover from. If you're a smoker and you go around smokers, I'm not talking about after the point where like yeah, the smell of smoke, you're like, ugh, that happens. But then there's a point where you like miss it and you're just like, oh, well, let me get a puff. Or you've got high blood pressure and you're not supposed to be eating that sodium, or you're not supposed to be getting those sweets because you're diabetic, and you're just like, oh, give me a little piece, right? And what do we know? When you get that little piece, it activates all of those cravings again, and now I'm trying to start all back over. And sometimes we can have physiological symptoms that are very strong. Like this is what happens with withdrawal. And so we really want to get ourselves in that position where we're not continuing in that cycle of starting, stopping, starting, stopping. So it's withdrawing and then recovering from the withdrawal symptoms. And then, I get okay for a little while and then I'm back in that cycle again, because these are some of the patterns that interfere with us being able to stay in that recovery if you do not change your routine. And this is why I said this information is for anyone. If you do not change your routine, if you continue to do the same things, you are going to be in that same pattern of habits that you're trying to break. We see it with exercise and trying to get back on track with exercise, trying to back on track with healthy eating, trying to get back on track with taking your medication as prescribed, and not missing those dosages as you're trying to get on track with sleeping and resetting your sleep cycle and doing that good sleep hygiene. Right. So anytime you are falling back into those old patterns, it's like you're having to reset every single time. And so then it makes it harder for you to be able to see the benefits of the positive changes as quickly. Right. So, because now my body's like, oh, we just wait a couple of weeks. Like, you're going to fall back out of this. We're going to be right back here. And this is why sometimes it's very hard for us to leave relationships with people who aren't good choices for us. And we keep going back to them because it's like, that's what I know, because it's become my pattern, it's become my habit. And so I have to sometimes really switch up a lot of things. It's interesting to me, like the small things have so much weight. So when I stopped eating meat, for example, and I went to plant-based, Publix has these smells at certain points of the day. They're very strong. When they bake their bread, that bread smell is very strong, and when they fry chicken, is very strong, right? And so I can't eat all the breads because some of them have dairy products in them and all that good stuff, and I don't eat the chicken. But when I tell you the smell of them, and that's the part of the craving. So I've literally had to be mindful of the routes I take. All right, and you're like, well, you could eat it if you wanted to. I could, but I recognize that health wise, it's not the best choice for me. And so, making good decisions sometimes for you is hard. Like, I know that chicken smells really good, but it just doesn't affect my body in a positive way. And so I have to accept that as a part of wanting to be healthier, that I have to let some of the things go, even if I could get away with eating them. And I just, not as much, right? But we talk about that you can't be partly sober, because once you take that drink, then you're starting all back over again. And we're going to have relapses along the way. But eventually, we want to get to a point where we're not continuing to put ourselves in that pattern of having relapses. Because I say, oh, I'll just do a little bit, I'll just do it this time, or it's a special occasion, right? And we slide back. But instead, I make that decision that it's going to be hard, and there are going to be people around me that are still doing this thing that I'm no longer doing. And so I may have to switch that up too. I might have to switch up the people that I'm around, the places that I go. I will tell people, especially if you're trying to get out of the habit of fried food, for example, right? So you're trying to come on over here to this grilled and raw food life, and then people are taking you to places where there's all this fried stuff. Like, you're going to be very tempted to eat those things. And so sometimes we have to be very mindful with regard to staying in this place of sobriety and recovery. Like, I'm not going to always necessarily be able to do the same things, even if it means that sometimes I'm just going to have to tell people who I really enjoy, hey, no, I can't do that unless we switch up that location. And I will also tell you that building healthy relationships with other people who are in that place of sobriety and that place of recovery is really important. And I know that for a lot of people, that's why they maintain that recovery support group, because you're going to need to be in places where you can help yourself when you're in a place where you might relapse. But also, I think helping other people gives us a sense of purpose and allows us to feel like we have more control over making these healthy changes, right? Self discipline is a really important aspect of recovery and making good, healthy decisions. And sometimes we're a little rough on that self discipline because we're tapped out because we're trying to control so much, which is why it's important for us to be very thoughtful of not putting ourselves in situations where we're constantly having to turn things down that are tempting. Like, okay, like how much can I tempt myself? As opposed to, let me just not put myself in that place so I'm not putting myself discipline in overdrive and burning it out. Um, but also recognizing that it's important for us as we're finding these support systems not to become codependent. We can transfer addictions. And so I think sometimes what ends up happening for us is we leave one thing alone and then pick up something else to put in its place that could be equally as unhealthy. But a lot of times we'll put weight on the unhealthy, like, oh, like, it's better for me to be codependent and like focusing on this other person than it is for me to be using this cocaine. But the truth be told is that anything that's addictive has the potential to be self destructive. And so it's important that you're not relying on that support system to give you an identity and a sense of worth. That you have to do that work within. I talk a lot about the importance of worth, because if you don't feel like you matter outside of what you are doing for someone, then it is going to be very hard for you not to fall back into patterns of doing things that are going to be counterproductive to your recovery process, right? Because it's hard to love yourself if that depends on others. Like, loving you is not dependent on anybody else. It's not dependent on the title you have. It's not dependent on how much money you have, your job you have, being able to be affirmed by other people. And so being able to have healthy relationships with good boundaries that aren't codependent is also a part of that sobriety period, and ways to protect yourself against relapsing. Because what's going to happen, like when I am dependent on this relationship to give me a sense of worth and value, and I get negative feedback in that relationship, or a person isn't available, I'm not affirmed in that relationship, or people are doing other things, and I start questioning whether or not I matter and my importance, and then I'm down that slippery slope, right? Some of the risk factors we talked about last week when we were addressing suicide awareness and prevention. And then I will also say to you that there is a such thing as sobriety fatigue. Like we just get exhausted emotionally, physically, just the stress of trying to maintain sobriety, the stress of trying to maintain those healthy choices to stay in that recovery, which is why it's important for us to have adequate support that can pour into us, that can help us, that can challenge us to work through these internal things that keep us focused on our own self care, that allow us to really think about the thoughts that we're feeding and to deal with the emotional pain and all of the things that go along with being in recovery. Recovery is tough. And just because you're in recovery doesn't mean that other people are necessarily tracking your recovery journey. And so for you, you're excited because you've hit these milestones, but then nobody says anything, right? And nobody's checking and asking you, like, how are you doing with your sobriety? You're headed out to these meetings, like, what are they adding for you? Like, what are some of the things you learn? Like, people aren't necessarily invested in that journey. And this is, I think, the other piece of why sometimes we get exhausted and have fatigue is because people are still, and understandably so, a little cautious around us because their expectation is that we are likely going to fall back into some of those old patterns. And so they're very attentive to certain things like, oh, like you switched up your behavior. Like, why are you out late? Why? Picked up exercise. Like, that's one of the things I used to use a lot at night when you all were getting ready for bed or, everybody was kind of logging or getting ready to kind of decompress for the day and get prepared for the next day. And so when you all were winding down and getting ready for bed and starting to go in that process, I would go out. That was my time of using. So night is really hard for me. So what I've done is I've adjusted my night schedule. So I work out during the time that I typically would have been out using because I would just leave home and then come back, before you guys woke up. And so you didn't know what I was out doing. Well, people remember that. They remember that you were out, you were using, especially once you kind of talk to them and you're going through this recovery process and you're making amends and all of these things. Like you're one of the ways that keeps us in recovery too is that we get rid of those behaviors that we were doing out of shame. We hide, we protect the addiction so people don't know. So when we start really talking about it and putting it out there, now people are checking that mouthwash container to make sure it's actually mouthwash and that there's not something else in there. That Stanley cup just has water in it and not something else. That you didn't mix something in with what we thought was coffee. That you're not going out and smoking and getting out in the air and trying to Febreze and refresh yourself, switch clothes, mouthwash, brush your teeth, everything before you get home. I know people that would literally get naked and go out to a place that was hidden and smoke so they wouldn't have any of the residue on their clothes. And they'd bring, wipes, wash up, all of this good stuff with them. So when they come home, that scent wouldn't be on them. Or, I go and I get high and I'm getting high like when you're gone, and so I don't see you for a couple of days. So I've had a chance to kind of recover, or I'm, telling you, oh, hey, it's a restful weekend for everybody. We're in a lounge. Nobody had to worry about anything because I know that I've been using, and so I'm gonna be crashing, right? Or you're down playing the game, and I'm upstairs getting high, or I am sneaking this food, right? Like, so I'm supposed to be on this meal plan and I'm working on dealing with my food addiction, but I'm going out and I'm actually sneaking other meals in outside of what this plan is. And I'm eating, get rid of the evidence before I come home. So you don't know, right? So again, people are sometimes mistrustful when we start changing up things and doing things different because in their mind, the explanation is, oh, you're back doing that same thing that you were doing before when you were not in this healthy place. And so sometimes it can also feel like people don't trust us, that they are doubting us, that they're questioning us. And, sometimes this is the part of that logic that can really set us back and have us relapse is this accusatory, well, if you're going to accuse me anyway, then I might as well be doing something for you to be accusing me for, right? Instead of getting into that place of recognizing like, hey, Like there are some things that I did that led to you not trusting me, and I can understand you having some questions about my behavior. What I'm going to do instead is like really over communicate with you and try to have you be aware of the process so you understand what I'm doing as replacement behaviors and how I'm trying to ensure that I don't relapse and that I have structure, because what we do know is a structured routine is what is going to allow us to be able to have long term changes, right? And so as we're maintaining this sobriety, then it's important for us to have goals and things that we're working toward, and that we have something that we can track them with, which means, again, I have to have that structure. I have to have these measurable things in place. And those things are stuff like exercise, activities and hobbies, eating healthy meals, getting that good water, getting good sleep and rest, learning relaxation strategies, mindfulness, problem solving, being able to get those finances on track. And I cannot underscore enough the importance of having support resources in all the areas that have been stressful. So if finances were stressful for you in this recovery period in your life, you need to have somebody who is helping you navigate through that financial stress. It could be a financial planner, it could be a financial coach, it might be a banker, an investor, someone who's working with you. You might be at Goodwill. I talk a lot about them and some of the resources that they have available. And so being able to find what those resources are that you qualify for, particularly when we don't have a lot of money, like the last thing we want to do is be spending money to figure out how to better manage our money. And so there are a lot of free resources out there. Being able to be in mental health counseling to address any of the mental health issues that were underneath the addictive behaviors, being able to address any of the relationship conflicts. Maybe I need to be in a different career, right? Because that was a huge stress and I need to switch things over. There are some career areas that are just very, very stressful, and where there's access to more of those things that could cause us to go back down that slippery slope of being in our addiction again. So I might have to switch jobs and get out of an environment. So I might need some vocational counseling in order for me to be able to switch careers and go in a different direction. I also think it's important for us to understand the importance of shame. So we talk about that difference between guilt and shame. Is guilt, I feel bad about something that I did. Shame is that now I feel like I'm a bad person because of what I did. And that's where the hiding comes from, and which is often why we in our addictions are hiding it, because we feel like I'm a horrible, wretched, unworthy, unlovable person because I'm doing this. Like, you're going to be so disappointed in me, and you're going to leave me, and all of the things that go through our heads. And so it's important for us to be able to work through those feelings of shame that are underneath. That's a trigger for us, right? And being able to fall back down into a place of relapse. And I will tell you all that sometimes you got to switch things up. Okay, like you may be going to a sobriety group, you may be going to a church, you might be having exercise, you may be going yoga, mindfulness, meditation, you may do art therapy, you may be in a group of people that are teaching you how to knit and crochet, you might be figuring out how to mix beats. Like, I don't want you to feel like you have to stay in, like, oh, I can only do these particular things for coping and to be able to be, more adaptive, healthy strategies for me. You may have to mix it up and be in a position where you're doing different things. And I think that's another reason why sometimes we end up being in those positions where we fall back and we relapse, because we haven't changed up our strategies and they're no longer being effective again. Now, I will tell you, in whatever stage you are in your recovery, it is important for you to be able to have the things in place that are going to allow you to be successful. And that does mean you have to have a plan. And I think a lot of times, especially when we relapse, we feel like, oh, I can get back on my own. I don't have to go back to all of those things that I was doing before. Like, it'll be much easier for me to get back sober again. But that's not necessarily the case. And as we talked about, like sometimes needing to change those thoughts and patterns, like we'll talk ourselves into things and make ourselves believe that we're better off in a better situation than we really are, which allows us to be able to have kind of one foot in, one foot out. So I'm still actually doing these things that are unhealthy for me, but I say that I'm in recovery and I'm not as bad as I used to be. And so we have to be very careful and very honest with ourselves about where we are. And oftentimes that's when that accountability person is really helpful, because I will tell myself whatever I want to tell myself that allow me to believe that I'm better. Often I actually am, which again, slippery slope. And then next thing you know, I'm all the way back into a point of using where I was previously. So I say that all to say recovery is an ongoing process. Being able to let go of something that physically and emotionally and behaviorally, oftentimes financially, even spiritually, affected you, you're going to need a lot of things in your life to be able to ensure that you are back on track, but that you understand what are the things that put you at high risk, right? So that involves honesty, that involves accountability, that involves support, and that also involves you being able to have replacement behaviors. Okay. Not only can you be well, but you can also maintain that wellness. Okay. Take good care.